Our second stop in the Kruger National Park was the Satara rest camp. At first we saw mostly familiar faces. Egyptian geese from, well, Egypt. Pied and woodland kingfishers hunting with great success. But it wasn't long before we had our eye in, and we started to observe species that were new to us. Considering there's less than 100 kilometres between the two rest camps, the variation in species observed was actually very surprising, to us at least. One of the first new species we observed was the European bee-eater. This species can actually be found, as the name implies, across Central and Southern Europe, although we've never observed it. Some of the birds that really jumped out to us though, especially as residents of the UK, were the various starling species that can be found in the park. The common or European starling that we are used to is certainly not an ugly bird. The two species of starling we spotted at Satara were something else entirely. Our next species really caught us quite by surprise. At a distance we thought they were simply common magpies, or perhaps the pied crows we'd seen elsewhere in the park and across Africa. However, a closer look showed that they had very significant tails and were completely the wrong build for a corvid. And without further ado, I present to you the African long-tailed shrike, also known as the magpie shrike. So it's not just me who gets confused. Not every bird in the park though is as difficult to identify, shall we say, as some of the others, or indeed perhaps quite as vibrant. The yellow-billed stork are significantly more conspicuous than the spurfowl. Not only do they stand a metre tall, but despite not normally making vocalizations, they certainly are not quiet around the riverside. And finally, something that shares the air with the birds, but of course is not in itself, we have the Epauleted Fruit Bat. And we really didn't have to travel very far to find these at all. Much like the birds, initially, at Satara, we saw many of the same species as we did at Kruger. The impala were, in the case of females, nursing their calves, although these calves did seem to be slightly older than the ones at Kruger, a little more independent and able to take care of themselves around the males that were continuing to posture, shall we say. But we did also start to encounter some newer species of antelope, specifically the waterbuck. At about 260 kilograms, waterbuck are nearly 4 times as heavy as an impala and are immediately recognizable for the large circular white pattern on their rump, which does in fact give them their scientific name of ellipsiprimnus. As you can see here, the waterbuck and the impala actually very often share the same space. Satara also marked our first introduction to the dwarf mongoose, an absolutely gorgeous little animal, and quite frankly, I love them, almost as much as I love the next species. I understand it's bad form to have a favourite, however, at Satara the tree squirrels were absolutely wonderful. Of course, not every animal in Kruger, and certainly not in Satara, is going to be small, cute and fuzzy. Surprisingly, we didn't see a particularly large number of elephants. At least, not up close. We saw many of them at a great distance, travelling either north or south, and the reason for this became clear enough fairly soon. Kruger and the other camps we visited where we saw significant numbers of elephants at closer distances have larger bodies of fresh flowing water. Satara, on the other hand, does not have a river nearby the camp, and instead the water supplies are from watering holes. These watering holes are generally occupied by hippo, and hippo are regrettably not among the best neighbours. They don't even generally get along with one another particularly well, let alone other species. We noted one evening that this individual appeared to have been evicted from its pod. Although perhaps it was never part of this pod and was merely an interloper, it was simply looking for somewhere to cool off at the end of the day. The resident hippos, however, were having absolutely none of this and firmly chased him a few meters downstream to where another pod was residing that they were quite happy to allow to remain. While the interloper initially appeared to be okay with this second group, they very quickly turned around and the lead male started making efforts to chase it off. The hippos don't have the waterways entirely to themselves. Many of the pools also have a resident population of crocodile. A healthy adult hippopotamus is unlikely to be overly concerned by a crocodile on their own, but we did observe a number of pods with juvenile hippo who would be at risk, so they generally stay apart. This small turtle or terrapin, however, appears not to have got the memo, or perhaps simply not realised there was a crocodile immediately in front of it as it slowly swam towards it. When it did realise, it very stealthily left. As we've observed previously, an area that has such an abundance of prey species will, of course, have a significant number of predators. The majority that we saw around Satara were either bateleurs, with their distinctively bright red faces and feet, we also observed significant numbers of tawny eagles, mostly from a distance in trees along the roadside, but one individual in particular frequented the camp and was quite adept at catching small birds and lizards and eating them above the area that we also habitually ate. Despite appearing to be a domestic shorthair, this is, in fact, an African wildcat. Among the cat species, they are one of the most successful hunters, owing at least in part to their wildly varied diet, and have been known to take young sheep or goats, and will also take antelope fawn if the opportunity presents itself.
It wasn't far from this watering hole that we met our first leopard. Socially, leopards are very different from lions and spend most of their lives solitary outside of the mating season. Despite this, they are genetically very closely related, having only diverged somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago. Leopards mostly hunt at night, and when not hunting, much like lions, they will tend to do nothing at all.
The absolute stars, however, of the predatory scene in Satara are the hyenas. There are believed to be several packs in the vicinity of Satara Rest Camp, some of which are tracked to give an idea of their location, purely for conservation purposes. I have mentioned previously that I am quite fond of these particular species of carnivores, and that the portrayal of them as cowardly scavengers in a certain well-known Disney film, along with many other articles of media, has done their species a great deal of harm over the years, resulting in profound prejudice against them. I'm not going to pretend they're not an unusual species. They are, strictly speaking, a feliform carnivore, i.e. cat-shaped or cat-like, but they hunt in a pack manner more reminiscent of canids, and they have a social structure that resembles that of baboons. The group we came across in Satara, however, were predominantly young cubs of various ages, and they displayed exactly the same behaviours as one might expect of puppies. Curiosity, playfulness, and frankly, they were beautiful. I do hope you feel the same, because I'm just going to leave this footage running for the crowds.